May 8, 1945. Berlin smelled of wet ash, brick dust, and smoke that had seeped into the bones of the city. Every breath carried the taste of destruction. Rubble filled the streets where trams once ran, and the silence between the occasional crack of gunfire or rumble of a passing tank was almost worse than the noise of battle. I held Lotta's hand, my 6-year-old daughter, her small palm sweaty against mine, as if she thought I might vanish into the ruins if she let go. My name is Anna Müller. I was 27, a seamstress before the war, a widow since 1943, when my husband was swallowed somewhere on the Eastern Front. He left in uniform, smiling bravely, and never returned. All I had left was this child, a satchel with a hymn book, and a body held together by stubbornness more than strength. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years had ended in 12, and its capital had collapsed into a graveyard. We were told the war was over, but it did not feel that way. Rumors rippled through the survivors. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. Hitler was dead. The Soviets controlled the East, and the Americans were pouring in from the West. What would become of us, the women and children of a defeated nation? Some whispered that we would all be executed, others that we would be deported to labor camps in Russia. Hope was as fragile as the paper we used for makeshift bandages. When the first American convoy entered our sector, jeeps with white stars, half-tracks with machine guns, trucks filled with supplies, I pulled Lotta closer and braced for the worst. Instead, a tall officer climbed onto the hood of a jeep, lifted a megaphone, and through a translator declared that we were prisoners of war, that we would be moved, fed, and kept safe. Safe. The word rolled through the crowd like an impossible promise. The first night we spent in captivity was inside a makeshift holding camp erected in the courtyard of a bombed-out school. The walls were pitted with shrapnel, the windows gaping holes that let in the cold night air. Hundreds of us crowded together, lying on damp ground, clutching children, whispering prayers. I traded the last scarf I owned for a piece of bread. Lotta devoured it so quickly she coughed crumbs back into my hand. I tried to laugh for her sake, but my stomach was empty and my eyes burned. Around us, babies whimpered for milk, and the old moaned in their sleep. Somewhere in the darkness, a woman screamed until a guard silenced her with a harsh bark of English I did not understand. I had been raised on propaganda, the same as everyone else. I remembered the posters, the voices on the radio declaring Americans weak, lazy, too fond of comfort to fight. Yet the men I saw wore heavy boots caked in mud, carried rifles like extensions of their bodies, and looked at us not with softness or hatred, but with a hard sort of duty. They seemed both impossibly young and impossibly old, their faces lined by fatigue. When they distributed rations, small cans of meat, biscuits so hard they cracked teeth, powdered coffee we had no way to prepare, our crowd lunged forward like animals. Some spat at the taste, calling it foul. Others, myself included, devoured every bite. For Lotta, even a bite of something salty and foreign was enough to still her hunger for a few hours. I told her it was a feast, though I remembered the stews I once cooked before the war, thick with potatoes and cabbage, food that now felt like a dream. Days blurred. The Americans organized us into groups, separating the sick into makeshift medical tents. Each morning we were counted, lined up like cattle. Guards stood with rifles slung across their shoulders, shouting instructions through translators. Some prisoners tried to barter jewelry or trinkets for more food. Some succeeded, some were shoved back into line. Hunger became the law. Once, I saw a boy no older than 10 try to steal a biscuit from a supply crate. An American soldier caught him by the collar, lifted him like a rag, then, astonishingly, set him down, placed the biscuit back in his hand, and ruffled his hair. The boy looked stunned, and so did we. It was in those early days that irony struck me hardest. We had believed the Americans would burn us, shoot us, grind us into dust. Instead, they gave us food we did not understand. They herded us behind barbed wire, yes, but they treated wounds. They buried the dead with dignity. They even laughed among themselves in ways that sounded almost human. The lies I had been fed all my life clashed violently with the sight of these men sitting on crates, writing letters, sharing cigarettes, sometimes even offering a smile to the children pressing against the wire. For me, every day was survival measured against Lotta's needs. Her shoes were torn beyond repair, her dress threadbare. She shivered at night, Her small body curled against mine for warmth. I told her stories to keep her mind away from hunger. Fairy tales, mostly, though I twisted their endings. I promised her that one day she would see a meadow again, that we would eat bread without mold, that the war would truly end for us. But in my private writing, on the margins of the hymn book I carried, I scrawled darker words. We are shadows of a nation that no longer exists. History has passed us by. We walk in its ruins, waiting for the living to decide if we belong in tomorrow. The routine of captivity dulled our terror, but sharpened our despair. Each sunrise meant another day of lining up, another ration, another night of whispered rumors. Would we be deported to America? To camps in France? To Siberia if the Soviets claimed us? No one knew. We were prisoners, and prisoners had no maps of their future. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the skeletal skyline of Berlin, I watched an American soldier share his cigarette with another, both laughing softly. The image seared itself into me because it was so ordinary. Ordinary after years of chaos felt almost miraculous. I wondered then, for the first time, if ordinary life might return to us one day. If my daughter might one day know bread with butter, music in cafes, laughter without fear. I did not know then that my story, which began in rubble and ended in survival, would pivot around a moment both absurd and unforgettable. Sitting across from an American soldier as he handed my daughter half of a hamburger, calling it McDonald's, a name I had never heard before. It would take years for me to understand what that word meant. Years before I saw the golden arches rise across Europe. And when I did, it carried me back to that moment of impossible kindness. But all of that was still ahead. For now, the ruins of Berlin were our cage, hunger our companion, and the Americans our unlikely wardens. That night, I kissed Lotta's forehead and whispered a promise I was not sure I could keep. Tomorrow will be better. I lay awake long after she slept, staring at the broken rafters above me, wondering if the world would allow such a promise to be true. If you want to follow this journey, from the ruins of Berlin to the day an American soldier shared something called McDonald's with us, subscribe now, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support keeps these forgotten stories alive. The days after the surrender stretched into an endless march of waiting, hunger, and uncertainty. Berlin was no longer a city, but a carcass, its streets clogged with bricks and twisted iron, its air fouled with smoke and rot. The Americans told us we would be relocated to camps outside the city. Relocated meant walking, miles and miles under the eyes of armed guards, our possessions carried in sacks or clutched to our chests. I took only the hymn book, a comb with missing teeth, and the hand of my daughter Lotta. She stumbled often, her legs too thin to keep pace, and each time I lifted her up, I wondered if my strength would hold until nightfall. We moved in columns, hundreds of civilians pushed forward by shouted orders. Some cursed the Americans, spitting in the dirt behind them, but most of us were too tired to protest. Hunger gnawed at us more cruelly than the rifles slung across their shoulders. Children whimpered for water. Old women shuffled until they collapsed by the roadside, left behind because no one could carry them. The smell of sweat and unwashed bodies mingled with the sweet stench of corpses hidden in ruined houses. I thought often of how the Reich had promised triumph, and here we were, ragged and barefoot, prisoners in our own land. At night we were herded into barns or the shells of abandoned factories. Straw on the floor served as beds, and rats scuttled between us, bold in their hunger. The Americans posted guards, but did not interfere when we bartered scraps of food or tore at each other in arguments. Once I saw two women fight savagely over a single can of beans, their faces twisted into masks of fury. Only when a soldier barked at them in English did they stop, trembling, clutching the dented tin between them. Hunger stripped us of dignity faster than chains ever could. Through it all, Lotta clung to me, her lips dry and cracked, her questions constant. "Mama, when will we go home? Mama, will they shoot us? Mama, what is America?" I answered with lies meant to soothe her. I told her America was a land with wide fields and gentle people. I told her the soldiers were stern but fair, that they would give us food if we behaved. I told her her father would be proud if we were brave. Inside, my heart twisted at each falsehood. But truth was too cruel for a child. After a week of marching and nights in barns, we arrived at a camp ringed with barbed wire and watchtowers. The sign outside, painted in English and German, declared it a civilian internment center. Inside, long wooden barracks lined the dirt roads, their walls smelling of damp straw and mildew. Guards directed us into separate huts, men to one side, women and children to another. Each barrack was filled with rough bunks stacked 3 high, mattresses stuffed with straw, lice already crawling across them. The air was thick with coughs and the sour reek of sickness. That first night in the barracks, I pressed Lotta against my side and listened to the chorus of misery. Babies whimpered. Old women prayed in whispers. Some wept openly, their sobs shaking the wooden walls. The Americans had posted guards outside, but did not interfere as long as we stayed inside. For the first time since the surrender, I felt the weight of captivity settle on me fully. We were no longer simply survivors of a lost war. We were prisoners of the victors. Food was issued twice a day, ladled from large pots in the mess hut. A watery stew of beans, sometimes potatoes, sometimes scraps of meat, black bread that crumbled in our hands, coffee made from roasted barley instead of beans. To me it was bitter and strange, but to Lotta it was a miracle. She clutched her tin bowl with both hands, slurping as if she feared it would vanish. I pretended to eat, pushing most of my portion toward her, telling her I was not hungry. But my body betrayed me with dizziness and weakness, my vision sometimes swimming as I tried to sew scraps of cloth into something resembling clothes for us. It was in the mess hut that I first truly watched the Americans. They were not cruel. They shouted orders, yes, and struck the ground with their boots to keep order, but they did not beat us. They kept their distance, their faces unreadable, but I saw how some of them slipped candy to children when officers were not watching. Once, I saw a soldier lean down and let a little boy hold his helmet, laughing as the child nearly toppled under its weight. It was a sound so ordinary, so human, that it startled me. We had been raised to believe Americans were devils, creatures of greed and vice, but here was one laughing with a child, as though war had never happened. At night, after Lotta fell asleep, I wrote again in my hymn book, "We are not what we were told we were. They are not what we were told they were. Everything is upside down. If survival is possible, it will not be through hatred, but through endurance." Yet endurance was tested daily. The latrines overflowed. Disease spread quickly. Typhus, dysentery, influenza. Illnesses struck down the weak. The camp doctors, some German, some American, tried to contain it, but medicines were scarce. We washed ourselves in cold water from a pump, scrubbing with rags until our skin bled. Lotta developed a cough that rattled her chest. Each night I lay awake, counting her breaths, terrified one would be her last. Still, moments of strangeness broke through. One afternoon, an American soldier sat outside our barrack repairing his boot. He noticed me watching and, with a small smile, tossed a piece of chewing gum through the wire at my feet. I stared at it, unsure if it was safe, until Lotta snatched it and popped it into her mouth. Her eyes widened as the sweetness filled her tongue. "Mama, it tastes like flowers," she said, chewing furiously. She offered me the second half, but I told her to keep it. For days, she chewed and chewed until the flavor was gone, then saved the gray wad in her pocket as if it were treasure. These small acts of humanity confused me more than cruelty ever could. Cruelty was expected in war. Kindness was not. Each gesture chipped away at the image of the enemy I had carried all my life. The weeks stretched into months. By July, the camp had settled into routine. Work details were organized: cleaning, repairing fences, cooking under supervision. I was assigned to mending uniforms, both German and American, my skill with a needle making me useful. For this, I sometimes received an extra ration of bread. I shared it with Lotta, watching her cheeks fill slightly, her eyes regain a spark of childhood. It was the only reward I needed, but the contradictions never stopped pressing against me. Outside the barbed wire, the Americans drove trucks loaded with supplies, smoked cigarettes, laughed, and wrote letters home. Inside, we scratched at lice and wondered if tomorrow would bring enough stew to keep us alive. Two worlds separated by strands of rusting wire. And yet, sometimes those worlds touched. A guard humming a German lullaby, a medic bandaging a prisoner's blistered foot, a soldier handing his ration biscuit to a hungry child. One evening, as the sun burned red through the haze, I stood near the fence holding Lotta's hand. An American soldier leaned against a post, eating something between two pieces of bread. The smell of cooked meat drifted toward me, rich and savory. My stomach clenched painfully. He noticed us staring, smiled faintly, and took another bite. Lotta's eyes followed every movement. I pulled her back, ashamed of our hunger, but the soldier only nodded politely. At that moment, I had no idea how that simple image, a man eating meat between bread, would soon become something unforgettable. For now, all we knew was captivity. But behind the barbed wire, behind the hunger and the shame, life flickered stubbornly. And in that flicker, I began to suspect that the world after war might look stranger than anything we had imagined. The summer of 1945 baked the camp in dust and heat. The barracks sweltered, the air thick with the sour odor of unwashed bodies and damp straw. My daughter Lotta, now 7, grew restless, asking each morning if today would be the day we were released. I had no answer for her, only the same tired promise, soon. But even I did not believe it. The war was over, yet our captivity stretched on, a limbo between the ruins of yesterday and a future we could not yet see. Each day followed the same rhythm. Roll call at dawn, rations at midday, work details until dusk. I spent hours sewing and repairing uniforms, sometimes American, sometimes German. The needle kept my hands busy and my mind from despair. Lotta helped where she could, sweeping floors, carrying water, anything to feel useful. She grew fascinated with the Americans, whispering questions about them whenever one passed near. Were they giants? Why did they laugh so much? Why did their boots shine when ours were only scraps? I told her they were men like any other, but even I was not sure I believed it. The Americans seemed to live in another world, though they were only a few meters beyond the barbed wire. They had cigarettes, radios that crackled with music, and food that smelled rich and strange. Sometimes the wind carried the scent of coffee, sometimes roasted meat. It was torture to breathe it in, knowing our stew was thin as water. Yet, curiously, the guards were not unkind. They barked orders, but rarely struck anyone. Occasionally, they even smiled at the children, tossing a sweet or stick of gum when officers weren't looking. It was on one such evening that my life shifted. The sun was low, painting the camp gold. The dust glowed in the air, and the line for rations was longer than usual. I sat with Lotta on the steps of our barrack, fanning her with a scrap of cardboard, when a young American soldier approached. He was perhaps 20, his helmet tipped back, his uniform dusty but neat. He crouched to eye level with Lotta, and in halting German asked her name. She whispered, "Lotta," too shy to look up. He smiled, reached into his pack, and pulled out something wrapped in wax paper. I thought it was bread at first, but when he unwrapped it, a wave of scent hit me. Warm, savory, unlike anything I had known. Between two soft rolls was a patty of meat, glistening with juices, with a slice of something yellow melted over it. The soldier broke it in half, handing one piece to Lotta and one to me. "Hamburger," he said slowly, as if teaching a new word. Then, with a grin, he added another word I had never heard before, McDonald's. I stared at him, uncomprehending. The word meant nothing, but the food in my hand was heavy, fragrant, impossibly rich. My fingers trembled. Could it be real? Was this a trick? Lotta's eyes widened, her hunger stronger than her fear. She bit into it first, and the sound she made was half sob, half laugh. Grease smeared her lips, and for the first time in years, she smiled as though she had remembered what childhood was meant to feel like. I took my own bite, and the taste exploded on my tongue. Salt, fat, warmth, everything our bodies had been craving for months. It was overwhelming, almost painful in its richness. I wanted to weep, not only because it was delicious, but because it was given freely, without demand, by a man who owed me nothing. For a moment, the war disappeared. There was no barbed wire, no shame, no hunger. There was only this absurd thing called a hamburger, and the kindness of a stranger who shared it. I looked at the soldier, searching his face for malice, but all I saw was a tired young man pleased to see a little girl eat. He gestured as if to say, "Go on, finish it." Then he stood, gave us a small salute, and walked back toward his post. The barrack buzzed with whispers that night. Others had seen, others had tasted. The rumor spread quickly. The Americans had food beyond imagination, food they called McDonald's. Some scoffed, calling it propaganda in edible form. Others grew bitter, muttering that even in captivity the victors flaunted their wealth. But for me, it was not about wealth or victory. It was about the look on my daughter's face as she licked grease from her fingers, her eyes alight with joy. That look was worth more than any flag or ideology. In my hymn book I wrote, "Today I ate something I did not know existed. Today my daughter laughed with food on her lips. Today the enemy became, for a moment, simply human." The days that followed were still hard. The rations returned to watery stew and black bread. Lotta's cough lingered. The camp still stank of disease and despair, but something inside me had shifted. I began to notice more details in the Americans, the way they joked with each other, the way they wrote letters home, the way they treated us with a brusque fairness that was better than cruelty. I realized then that our lives might not be defined solely by defeat, but by the moments of grace we stumbled upon in the rubble. Months later, long after we were released and began the slow journey of rebuilding, I would pass a storefront in Munich with golden arches above it. "McDonald's," the sign read. I stood frozen, my daughter tugging my sleeve, and I remembered that day in the camp when an American soldier shared his strange sandwich with us. It was not the food itself that mattered. It was the mercy it carried, the bridge it built between enemy and enemy. But in 1945, as I lay beside my daughter on the straw mattress that night, listening to her steady breathing after a full belly, I felt hope flicker in me for the first time since the war began. And that hope was flavored with the taste of meat and bread and the kindness of a boy in uniform. The war had ended, but captivity did not vanish overnight. Through the summer and autumn of 1945, we remained behind the barbed wire, our lives suspended between defeat and freedom. Days passed in routines that no longer terrified us, but wore us down with monotony. Roll call at dawn, work details, rations that kept us alive, but never satisfied. Yet after the day the soldier shared his hamburger, everything seemed a little different. It was as if the taste lingered in the air, a promise that the world beyond the fence might still hold something unexpected. Lotta clung to that memory, speaking often of the American bread with meat, as if repeating it might summon another. By late 1945, transports began carrying prisoners back into what was left of Germany. Our turn came in November. The morning was cold, the ground frozen hard beneath our worn shoes. We were loaded into the back of a truck, the engine coughing to life as guards shouted instructions. Lotta sat on my lap, bundled in a blanket I had sewn from scraps of uniforms. She was stronger now, her cheeks fuller, her laughter returning in small bursts. She asked me if we would see the kind soldier again. I told her no, but that sometimes a single kindness was enough to carry us a long way. The journey back to Berlin was like traveling through a graveyard. Villages lay flattened, fields unplowed, rail lines twisted like broken toys. When we arrived, the city I once knew had become a wasteland. My childhood street was unrecognizable, houses gutted by fire, churches reduced to blackened shells. The apartment where I had lived with my husband before the war was nothing but a pile of bricks. My parents were gone, their fate swallowed by the chaos. Only neighbors remained, thin shadows of themselves, their eyes dulled by loss. Survival became a daily struggle again, though in a different way. There was no barbed wire, but food was scarcer outside the camp than it had been within. Rations were issued by the occupying authorities, and long lines snaked through the ruins as women clutched tin cans and children whimpered for bread. I traded what little I had left, thread, needles, my comb, for potatoes and coal. At night, we huddled in a single room of a half-collapsed building, our breath steaming in the cold air. Yet even in that darkness, hope glimmered. Lotta would whisper, "Mama, one day we will eat the American bread with meat again." It became her fairy tale, her story to ward off hunger. Over the years that followed, Germany struggled to rebuild. I took in sewing, patched uniforms for Allied soldiers, stitched dresses from curtains for women who wanted to feel human again. Lotta grew taller, her laughter more frequent, though she never forgot the taste of that strange sandwich. By the early 1950s, American culture seeped into our broken streets. Jazz spilled from radios, Chewing gum appeared in shops, and then one day, in Munich, I saw it. A glowing sign with golden arches, spelling out a name I remembered only vaguely: McDonald's. I froze, staring as people filed inside, emerging with paper bags and cups, smiling as though eating itself had become entertainment. Lotta, now a young woman, tugged my arm. "Mama, that is it, isn't it? The thing the soldier gave us." And in that instant, the memory rushed back. The dusty evening, the soldier crouching, the wax paper in his hand, my daughter's smile as grease stained her lips. I felt tears prick my eyes. Yes, it was the same. Not in form, perhaps. This was commerce, a chain, a business. But in spirit, it carried me back to the moment when mercy crossed the lines of war. I realized then that the hamburger had become more than food to us. It was a symbol. To Lotta, it was the taste of survival, of kindness in a place where kindness should not have existed. To me, it was proof that even in the ruins of ideology, human beings could surprise one another. The Reich had promised greatness and delivered rubble. An enemy soldier had shared his meal and delivered hope. History is cruelly ironic that way. Now, as I write these words decades later, the world has changed beyond recognition. Germany rose from its ashes, rebuilt, reshaped, reborn. The Americans went home, their soldiers buried in foreign soil or grown old in their own land. McDonald's stands on corners in every city, ordinary, forgettable to most. But to me, every golden arch is a monument, not to war, not to victory, but to a single young soldier who looked at a starving child and decided to share his food. That is the memory I pass to my grandchildren when they beg me for stories. I tell them of bombs and rubble, yes, but also of the day their mother, then a little girl, laughed with grease on her chin because an enemy soldier gave her a hamburger. They giggle, thinking it funny, ordinary, not realizing how extraordinary it was. I do not mind. Perhaps it is better they see it as ordinary. That means the world has healed. Still, in quiet moments, I close my eyes and return to that evening in the camp. I see the dust glowing in the sunset, hear the rustle of paper as the soldier unwrapped his meal, feel the weight of it in my hands. I taste the salt and fat, the warmth and life. And I remember thinking, perhaps we are not doomed to be enemies forever. Perhaps there is something stronger than ideology, something as simple as sharing food. If you have walked this journey with me, from the ruins of Berlin to the moment hope tasted like a hamburger, then I ask you to keep these memories alive. Subscribe to this channel, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments. Every act of remembrance matters because the small mercies of the past are what shape the humanity of the future.